They handed the folded flag to a 9-year-old girl. The whole town wept in the November cold. The only one in that churchyard who refused to grieve had 4 legs. While the bugler played taps over a closed and empty casket, the German shepherd rose from where he lay in the frozen grass, walked the length of the gravel path, and sat down at the front gate facing the road. Ears up, spine straight. It was not the posture of a dog in mourning. It was the posture of a dog waiting for someone to come home, and he would not be called off it. He held it through the eulogy. He held it as the cars pulled away. He held it into the dark. Gunnery Sergeant Logan Hayes stood at the edge of the crowd and watched the dog do it. And a cold that had nothing to do with the weather moved through him. He had seen rangers sit exactly like that before, just once, in a dusty kennel yard half a world away. It had not meant grief that day. It had meant he's coming. They had buried Sergeant Caleb Mercer that morning with full military honors and a flag-draped box that everyone agreed it was kinder not to open. The dog disagreed. And the dog, Logan was about to spend the next 6 days learning, was right. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single one, and what you're about to hear will remind you that some kinds of love refuse to accept a goodbye the rest of the world has already signed. Logan Hayes was 41 years old and built like a man who had carried other men on his back and remembered the weight of each one. He stood just under 6'2", broad and squared through the chest, with the kind of stillness in his body that made people lower their voices around him without knowing why. His hair was dark, cropped close, going gray at the temples, and a pale seam of scar ran from his left ear down into the collar of his dress blues. His hands were enormous and careful. When he moved through a room, he moved along its edges, his back never quite to the door. A habit 15 years of service had welded into him so completely that he no longer noticed he was doing it. His eyes were a flat, pale gray, the color of the sky over the funeral that morning. And they had a quality people who met him remembered long afterward without being able to name. They did not flinch, and they did not perform. They were the eyes of a man who had looked at the worst things the world manufactures, and had decided that the only respect he could still pay them was to keep looking. He was not a hard man by nature. He had simply learned to keep the soft parts somewhere the job couldn't reach them. He spoke rarely and meant all of it, and he carried himself with the contained, banked force of someone capable of a great deal of damage who had organized his entire life around never needing to cause any. He had served 15 years in the United States Marine Corps, the last several as a team leader in a special operations element, and he had been Sergeant Caleb Mercer's superior, his friend, and on the worst night of both their lives, the man giving the orders. 4 deployments, 3 to Afghanistan, 1 to Syria. Caleb had been his lead dog handler, and Ranger had been Caleb's working dog, and on a moonless night in the Helmand River Valley, a vehicle Caleb was riding in had been struck by an explosively formed penetrator and rolled into a canal in the dark and the chaos that followed. And when the count was done at dawn, Caleb Mercer and one of the local interpreters were unaccounted for. The recovery teams found what they found. The determination came back presumptive. Logan had flown home 11 days later with a medical retirement of his own, a left knee held together with titanium, and a debt he did not know how to pay to a family in Wyoming who had lost the man he had been responsible for bringing home. He had come to the funeral to stand in the back and bear it. He had not come expecting a dog wow to refuse to bury him. Ranger was a 7-year-old German shepherd, sable and black, 81 pounds of trained and patient muscle even now, with a coat that ran dark along the spine and burned to deep amber at the chest and legs. He had been wounded in the same blast that took Caleb, a long furrow of scar tissue down his right shoulder where shrapnel had opened him, and a clipped place on his left ear that had healed into something that looked almost deliberate. He had been pulled from the canal alive, medically evacuated, treated, and retired from service. And the Marine Corps had sent him home to Caleb's next of kin 3 weeks before the memorial, which was how he came to be lying in the frozen churchyard grass on the morning they buried the man he was waiting for. He moved with an economy that took years to build, never reacting to noise, only ever to meaning. He had been Caleb's partner through 2 deployments and 400 patrols, and he was, in every way that the word is supposed to mean something, family. He did not know the word presumptive. He knew the sound of one particular truck, and he had not heard it yet, which to a dog like Ranger meant only one thing. The waiting was not over. The town was called Sundance, tucked under the cold shoulder of the Bear Lodge Mountains in the northeast corner of Wyoming. A place of 1 main street and 2 churches and a feed store where everyone knew the Mercer name. It was the 3rd week of November, and the first hard snow had come and gone, and left the ground frozen iron gray, and the wind came down off the high country with nothing to slow it. The Mercer house sat at the end of a long gravel drive a mile out of town, a white 2-story with a wraparound porch and a front gate at the road where for 9 years a little girl had stood every homecoming to watch for her father's truck. The air out there smelled of wood smoke and snow, and the particular metallic stillness of deep cold. It was the kind of quiet that should have been peaceful, and instead, that November, felt like a held breath. Caleb's older brother Derek had moved into that quiet like he belonged in it. Derek Mercer was 47, soft-handed and well-dressed. The kind of man who remembered your wife's name and asked after your knee and made you feel, in the moment, genuinely cared for. He sold insurance 2 counties over, and he had held power of attorney over Caleb's affairs for the duration of the deployment, managing the bills and the accounts and the mortgage while his brother was overseas. And the whole town considered him a godsend to a family in crisis. What the whole town did not know was that Derek Mercer owed a great deal of money to people who did not send polite letters, that he had been moving sums out of his brother's accounts for the better part of a year, and that a living Caleb who came home and looked at a statement was a problem Derek could not survive. He was not a violent man. He was simply a man who had never once been told no, and who had arranged the last 11 months of his life around the quiet, reasonable, paperwork-shaped assumption that his brother was not coming back. "I loved my brother," he told the room at the reception, dabbing his eyes. "But at some point loving him means letting him rest." He believed he was untouchable. For 11 months, he had been. The girl's name was Maddie, and she was 9 years old, and she had not cried where anyone could see her. She had stood at the graveside in a coat too thin for the weather, and folded the corner of the flag they gave her over and over with 2 small fingers, smoothing it flat and folding it again, because her hands needed something to do that her face would not allow. She had been the one feeding Ranger since he came home, the one who slept on the floor beside him the first week because he wouldn't settle, the one who understood without being told that the dog was the last warm piece of her father left in the house. She was the kind of child who carried more than a child should and asked for nothing. And when her Uncle Derek had knelt down in front of her the week before and told her, gently, in his reasonable voice, that she needed to be brave now because her dad wasn't coming back, she had looked past him, out the window, to where the dog sat at the gate. And she had thought, with the stubborn clarity that adults lose and dogs never do, Ranger doesn't think so. Logan stayed in Sundance after the funeral when he had meant to leave that afternoon. He told himself it was respect. It was the dog. He drove out to the Mercer place the next morning under a low pewter sky and found Ranger still at the gate, frost in his coat, having refused to come inside all night. And he found Derek Mercer on the porch on the phone. And the two facts arranged themselves in Logan's mind in a way he did not like. He crossed the yard slowly. Ranger's head turned at the sound of his boots, and the dog's tail moved once, the only motion he made. "He won't come in," Maddie said from the doorway, small and fierce. "He's waiting." Logan crouched by the dog, his knee complaining, and looked down the empty road the way Ranger was looking down it. "I know what he's doing," he said quietly. He did not say the rest of it out loud. Derek came down the porch steps with his phone pocketed and his condolence face on. "Gunny Hayes, good of you to stay." He glanced at the dog and his mouth tightened. "I'll be honest with you, that animal's becoming a problem. Won't eat, won't come inside, sits out here scaring my niece half to death, waiting on a man who—" He lowered his voice, mindful of Maddie, who isn't going to drive up that road. "I've got a fella coming Thursday to take him. It's not healthy. For her or him." "He's a trained working dog," Logan said. He did not raise his voice. He never did. "He's not confused. He's telling you something." Derek smiled the way men smile at things they have already decided are beneath them. "He's a dog, Gunny." Behind them, at the gate, Ranger had not moved, and his lip had pulled back off his teeth without a single sound when Derek's voice rose and settled again when it dropped. Logan saw it. He filed it with everything else. He left without arguing, which Derek took for agreement, and which was the first mistake Derek Mercer had made in 11 months. That afternoon, Logan made 3 calls from the cab of his truck. The first was to a casualty assistance officer he'd served with named Reyes, who pulled the file and went quiet, and then told Logan a thing that turned the cold in his chest to something sharper: that there had been no positive identification of remains in Caleb Mercer's case. That the determination had been presumptive based on the circumstances of the blast and the canal, and that, Reyes hesitated here, somebody stateside had been calling the office for weeks, pushing hard to have the finding finalized and the certificate issued. The number, when Reyes read it off, was Derek Mercer's cell. The second call was to Logan's former sergeant major, who still had reach into the medical evacuation network and who agreed, off a hunch and a debt of his own, to run the unidentified casualties from that engagement against the casualty roster. The third call Logan made was to a sheriff's deputy in Crook County named Whitaker, whose father had been a Marine, and he asked Whitaker one question: "How fast can you pull a power of attorney's account access if there's reason to think it's being abused?" The answer to that came back faster than Logan expected, and it was not good, and it set the clock running. Derek had spent the morning at the county office. The death determination was set to be finalized in 6 days, and Derek had already filed to release the survivor benefits and the mortgage payoff into an account only he could touch, and he had moved the dog's removal up from Thursday to the following morning. Logan stood in the cold outside the feed store and understood that he was now in a race he could lose. Maddie called him that night, whispering so her uncle wouldn't hear, to tell him the man was coming for Ranger at 8. "Please," she said, 9 years old and out of other adults to ask. "He's the only one who believes me." Logan absorbed it the way he had absorbed worse, standing still in the dark with his breath fogging, and he made a decision he did not announce to anyone. Out at the Mercer gate, Ranger lay down in the frost facing the road and did not sleep. He had heard nothing yet, but something in the air had changed, the way it changes before weather, and the old dog held his post and waited for the sound he had been listening 9 years to hear. Logan was at the Mercer place at 6:40 the next morning, and he was not alone. He had Deputy Whitaker in a county truck behind him. He had a folder on the passenger seat with a sheaf of account statements and a phone log. And in his pocket, his phone held a message that had come in at 6:12 that morning from his sergeant major. 4 words long, that he had read 11 times and still could not entirely feel. It's him. He's alive. The white sedan with government plates turned onto the gravel road at 7:51, 9 minutes before the man who was coming for the dog, and before any human being in that yard understood what was happening. The dog took over. Ranger had been lying at the gate. Now he stood. He did not bark. He squared his body toward the road, and his ears came forward, and his whole frame changed. The readiness becoming something else, something certain. And he pressed against the gate and made a sound, low in his chest, that Logan had heard exactly once before, in a kennel yard in Helmand. The morning Caleb's convoy came back early. The dog knew before the car stopped. The dog knew before the door opened. He had been right for 6 days and 9 years. And now, at last, the world was about to catch up to him. The casualty assistance officer who stepped out of the sedan was Reyes, and he had flown half the night to deliver the news in person the way it is supposed to be delivered. And he stood in the cold Wyoming morning and told the Mercer family, with Maddie's mother gripping the porch rail and Maddie frozen in the doorway, that Sergeant Caleb Mercer had been pulled alive from that canal by a coalition patrol, evacuated unconscious and unidentified to a military hospital in Germany, kept under for 2 surgeries and a long-induced coma, and identified 4 days ago by DNA when he finally woke and could not, at first, tell them his own name. He was alive. He was recovering. He was coming home. Maddie did not scream or cry. She walked down the steps in her socks across the frozen ground to the gate. And she put both arms around the dog's neck, and she said into his fur, so quietly that only Logan was close enough to hear it, "I told them you knew." Derek Mercer had come out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves, and the color had gone out of his face. That's wonderful," he said. "That's a miracle. I always hoped." "You called the casualty office 11 times in 3 weeks, Logan said. And he did not raise his voice, and the quiet of it stopped Derek cold. He laid the folder on the porch rail. He laid the phone log beside it. Deputy Whitaker came around the truck. "You pushed to have your living brother declared dead. You moved his benefits into an account he can't see. You've been pulling money out of his family for a year, and you needed him gone so the statements would stop." Logan looked at him without anger, which was worse than anger. He sent his dog home to his daughter. "And you were going to have the dog put in a truck this morning because the dog was the only one in this county telling the truth." "You can't prove," Derek started. And then he looked at the folder and the phone log and the deputy, and the entitled certainty drained out of his voice and left something small behind. "Caleb would understand. I was managing things. You don't know the pressure I was—" He turned to his sister-in-law on the porch. Tell them I was helping." Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Maddie's mother covered her mouth. A neighbor who had come to check on the family stood at the edge of the drive and looked at Derek Mercer the way a whole town will look at a man, all at once, when it finally sees him. The deputy read him his rights on his brother's front porch. And when Reyes turned his phone around and put Caleb on a video call from the hospital bed in Germany, thin and bruised and grinning through a split lip, and said, "Somebody here wants to see you," Ranger heard the voice come tinny out of the little speaker, and the old dog's tail came up, and he barked once at the phone, and then he spun in a full circle in the frost like a puppy. And that was the moment the whole yard finally broke and wept. By the following spring, the snow was off the Bear Lodge, and the grass behind the Mercer house had come up green, and the gate at the end of the drive was just a gate again. Caleb Mercer came home on a Tuesday in March, walking with a cane and a long way still to go. His left side rebuilt and his hearing half gone on one ear, and when his truck, Logan had gotten it running again over the winter, finally turned onto that gravel road. Ranger was at the gate where he had always been, and this time the waiting ended the way the dog had always known it would. The shepherd cleared the fence. He hit Caleb's chest going full speed and put them both down in the wet spring grass, and Caleb Mercer lay there laughing and crying with 80 pounds of dog on top of him and his daughter running down the drive behind, and not one of them was in any hurry to get up. Derek Mercer pleaded guilty to embezzlement, financial exploitation, and fraud against the federal benefits system, and was sentenced to 4 years and a restitution order that took the house he'd been so careful to protect. Reyes made Master Sergeant that summer. Deputy Whitaker got a letter of commendation he tried to refuse. And Logan Hayes, who had come to Wyoming to stand in the back of a funeral and carry his guilt home with him, instead bought 40 acres outside Sundance and stayed, close enough to drive out on Sundays, close enough to watch an old dog he had served beside grow gray and slow and happy, in a yard full of a child's laughter, close enough finally to set the weight down. Sometimes the truth doesn't come to us through the people we trust to deliver it. Sometimes it comes through the one heart that loved without conditions and refused to read the paperwork. The world is quick to sign its goodbyes, quick to fold the flag and close the box and tell a child to be brave. But love, the real kind, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything, does not know how to give up on someone it has decided to wait for. God does not always answer us in the voice we expect. Sometimes he answers through a faithful creature sitting in the frost at the end of a road, holding a vigil the rest of us were too reasonable to keep, insisting on a hope we had already buried. The faithful are not always the loud ones. Sometimes they have 4 legs and a scar and a memory of one particular truck, and they are right when everyone else is wrong. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty still exists in this world and that hope is sometimes the bravest thing a soul can hold on to. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us this: have you ever known an animal who understood something the rest of the world refused to see? Your story may be exactly the light someone else needs tonight. And if you believe in stories of faith, courage, and the quiet loyalty that brings the lost back home, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, keep watch over the ones you are still waiting for, and remind you always, the ones who truly love you never stop believing you are coming home.